The year was 1861. The United States of America, a young nation that had once fought for its independence, now stood on the edge of a precipice. Tensions had been simmering for decades, and what had once been a dream of unity had fractured into two irreconcilable halves. The North, with its industrial power and growing abolitionist movement, stood in stark contrast to the South, where the economy thrived on the backs of enslaved people. The nation was divided, not just by geography, but by ideology, culture, and a way of life that seemed worlds apart. This was no longer a question of whether the nation would split. The real question was when, and more importantly, how. The political and moral debates had become so charged that no compromise seemed possible. Slavery, states' rights, economic power, and territorial expansion were all clashing in a battle for the future of the country. Every move was a game of high stakes, with the fate of millions hanging in the balance. And yet, no one could have predicted just how quickly it would all come to a head. The tension was about to explode, and when it did, it would set the stage for a war unlike any the country had ever seen. In 1819, the United States found itself standing on the edge of an invisible line. 11 free states, 11 slave states. On the surface, it appeared to be the perfect balance. But beneath this fragile facade, the cracks were already starting to show. The nation, still young and full of promise, was unknowingly teetering on the brink of a deep division that would tear it apart in the coming decades. As the 19th century unfolded, a powerful idea began to take root in the American psyche: manifest destiny. This belief, that the United States was destined to expand westward, would soon become a driving force behind American politics and actions. The idea seemed to promise endless opportunity and growth, but it would also expose the raw tensions at the heart of the nation. Expansion meant new territories, and with them, the question of whether they would be free or slave states. This wasn't just about land, it was about power, control, and the future of slavery itself. In the North, abolitionists had already started pushing for the end of slavery, seeing the institution as a direct contradiction to the nation's founding ideals of freedom and equality. But in the South, things were different. Slavery wasn't just an institution, it was the backbone of the Southern economy. The vast plantations of the South relied heavily on slave labor, and without it, their entire way of life would collapse. These economic and moral divides were growing more pronounced, and as the nation expanded westward, so did the question of whether the new territories would be allowed to continue the practice of slavery. In 1818, the state of Missouri applied for statehood, and with it, the delicate balance of power in the United States was on the verge of being shattered. Missouri's application would tip the scales in favor of the South. It was clear from the start that Missouri was eager to join the Union as a slave state. This was more than just a state joining the Union, it was a direct challenge to the balance of power between free and slave states. The North saw this as a direct threat. Expansion of slavery meant the deepening of a system they considered immoral and contrary to everything the nation had stood for. They feared that allowing Missouri to enter the Union as a slave state would open the door for slavery to spread further into the West, strengthening the South's hold over the country. The South, on the other hand, had a completely different perspective. They believed that each new state should have the right to decide for itself whether it would permit slavery. They saw the North's resistance to Missouri's entry as an attempt to impose Northern values on the rest of the country, undermining the principles of states' rights. But in 1820, Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House, proposed a compromise. The deal was simple yet significant: Missouri would join as a slave state, but in return, Maine would enter as a free state. This compromise was intended to keep the balance intact. But, more importantly, it marked the first real sign of the fractures that would eventually tear the nation apart. The Missouri Compromise also included an agreement on where the line would be drawn: territories north of 36° 30' latitude, except for Missouri, would be free of slavery, while those south of the line would permit it. At the time, this seemed like a fair solution, a temporary bandage for a nation on the brink of civil war. But Missouri was just the beginning. As the nation expanded further westward, the stakes would grow even higher. The 1840s were a time of immense change. Texas, once part of Mexico, had won its independence just a few years earlier, but now it had its eyes set on something much bigger, joining the United States. However, the addition of Texas came with a heavy price. Texas wanted to join as a slave state. The South, with its economy tied to slavery, saw this as an opportunity to tip the scales in their favor. But the North, already alarmed by the expansion of slavery, wasn't about to let that happen without a fight. And into this already charged atmosphere stepped James K. Polk, a president with a vision for American expansion. Polk was a fervent believer in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to expand across the continent. Texas was just the beginning. Polk wanted more. He had his eyes set on California, New Mexico, and even more territories. He believed that the future of America lay in these new lands, and he wasn't willing to back down. Polk's vision set the stage for the Mexican-American War. In 1846, Polk sent American troops to the disputed territory along the Texas border. Mexico, furious over the U.S.'s blatant expansionist moves, fired on the American soldiers, and that was all the excuse Polk needed. War was declared. But the Mexican-American War wasn't just about territory, it was about securing the South's future. For the Southern states, this war was a chance to gain more land where slavery could spread. For the North, it was a terrifying prospect. The war dragged on from 1846 to 1848, and in the end, Mexico was forced to cede vast amounts of land to the United States. California, New Mexico, Arizona, and much more became part of the U.S., but with this acquisition came an even bigger problem: how would these new territories be governed? By the time California sought to join the Union in 1850, California's bid to join as a free state pushed the already fragile Union to the brink. If California joined as a free state, it would upset the balance of power in Congress, giving the North an advantage. The South was determined to preserve its way of life, and the stakes were higher than ever. The result? The Compromise of 1850, a last-ditch effort to preserve the Union. Under the Compromise, California was admitted as a free state, but in return, the South was granted something they had long demanded: the Fugitive Slave Act. This law required Northerners to return runaway slaves to their owners, even if they had escaped to free states. The North, already on edge about the spread of slavery, was enraged. They saw this law as a betrayal, a direct challenge to their moral standing. But the Fugitive Slave Act wasn't the only contentious piece of the compromise. It also introduced the idea of popular sovereignty. The new territories gained from Mexico, New Mexico, and Utah would decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. This meant that the people living in these territories could vote on the issue, leaving the question of slavery to the whims of local populations. This wasn't the peace the country had hoped for. The Fugitive Slave Act galvanized the abolitionist movement, angering those in the North who felt the country was sliding backwards on the issue of slavery. Meanwhile, the South was emboldened, believing that they had won a major victory. But in truth, the Compromise of 1850 was just another temporary fix to a problem that would not go away. Each compromise, each concession, was just pushing the inevitable a little further down the road. By 1854, Senator Stephen Douglas proposed a radical idea: popular sovereignty. In simple terms, this meant that the residents of each new territory could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. No longer would Congress decide. It would be left up to the people living there. On paper, this sounded like a fair solution. But in reality, it was a recipe for disaster. The Kansas-Nebraska Act opened the floodgates, and both pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed into Kansas, eager to tip the scales in their favor. It was a race to see who could gain control of the territory's vote, but instead of peaceful debates, what followed was violence, brutal, unrelenting violence. The conflict soon came to be known as Bleeding Kansas, and the name said it all. In the battle for Kansas, men were not just debating principles, they were killing each other over them. Guerrilla warfare erupted across the state, with massacres and skirmishes that shocked the nation. People on both sides weren't just willing to fight, they were willing to die to ensure their vision of America was realized. The idea that slavery could spread westward was no longer just a political issue, it was a life-or-death struggle that had torn the nation apart in miniature. The violence escalated so quickly that it felt like a microcosm of the larger war that was coming. Families were divided, towns were burned, and the rule of law seemed to vanish in favor of bloody vengeance. Kansas was no longer a territory, it had become a battleground. And the entire country was watching, unsure of how much longer they could hold the Union together. By 1861, Kansas finally entered the Union as a free state, but the damage had already been done. The brutality of bleeding Kansas had exposed the depth of the divide. The North and South could no longer pretend that the issues of slavery and states' rights were matters for debate. Violence had become the language of the nation, and it was only a matter of time before that violence would erupt into something far worse. As if the violence of bleeding Kansas wasn't enough, the year 1857 brought a decision that would send shockwaves through the entire nation. Dred Scott, a slave, had been taken by his owner to free states and territories. Scott, believing that he had become free through his residence in these regions, sued for his freedom. What followed was a case that would change the course of history, Dred Scott versus Sanford. The case made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the ruling that came down was both shocking and devastating. Chief Justice Roger Taney delivered the opinion of the court, and what he said was nothing short of explosive. Taney ruled that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not sue in federal court, as they were not considered citizens. This ruling alone would have sent a shock through the North, but it didn't stop there. The court went even further, declaring that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. This meant that the Missouri Compromise, the very agreement that had kept the Union balanced for decades, was now declared unconstitutional. For the North, the ruling was a devastating blow. Not only had the Supreme Court effectively legalized slavery in the territories, but it also sent a clear message that the government would not stand in the way of the South's right to expand slavery wherever they wished. The North saw this as a dangerous precedent, one that could lead to the spread of slavery across the entire country. For the South, the ruling was a victory, a powerful affirmation that the institution of slavery was not just legal but protected by the highest court in the land. They were emboldened by the decision, believing they had a clear path to expand slavery without fear of federal interference. But this decision didn't just deepen the divide, it shattered any hope for a peaceful resolution. The country was now divided in ways that seemed irreparable. The Dred Scott decision made it clear that the battle over slavery wasn't just a political fight, it was a fight for the very soul of the nation. The tension had been building for years, but it wasn't until April 12, 1861, that it all boiled over. Fort Sumter, located in the heart of Charleston Harbor, South Carolina, was the flashpoint. The Union had maintained control of the fort, but with South Carolina now part of the Confederacy, its government demanded that the Union forces surrender the fort. The Union forces, surrounded and outnumbered, refused. It didn't take long for the situation to escalate. In the early hours of the morning, the Confederates opened fire on the fort. The first shots of the Civil War were fired. And just like that, the country's fragile peace shattered into open warfare. The attack on Fort Sumter wasn't just an isolated incident, it was the signal that the war had begun. The Confederates had made their move, and the Union was left with no choice but to respond. President Abraham Lincoln wasted no time. The attack on Fort Sumter was more than an assault on a Union outpost, it was an attack on the Union itself. Lincoln called for 75,000 troops to suppress the rebellion. In doing so, he solidified the divide between the North and South. No more compromises. No more hoping for a peaceful resolution. War was now the only option. And as the news spread across the country, it was clear this was no longer a political debate. This was now about survival. For the South, it was about preserving their way of life, and for the North, it was about preserving the Union. The shots fired at Fort Sumter would echo for years, changing the course of American history forever. The early months of the war were anything but easy for the Union. Fort Sumter marked the beginning, but it was only the first of many obstacles. Union leadership was still in its infancy. There were no seasoned generals with battle-hardened experience, and the North's initial efforts to crush the rebellion were met with failure. In battles like Bull Run, 1861, the Union forces were outmaneuvered, and what was expected to be a quick victory turned into a humiliating defeat. At Bull Run, General Irvin McDowell led the Union Army, confident that the sheer number of men would be enough to overwhelm the Confederates. But the Confederacy, led by General Pierre G.T. Beauregard and General Joseph E. Johnston, had other plans. The Union forces, unprepared for the intensity of the fight, broke ranks, leading to a catastrophic defeat. It was a wake-up call for the North. The war would not be over quickly. This wasn't going to be a battle of a few weeks, it would be a long, grueling conflict. Leadership was a constant challenge for the Union in the early stages of the war. McDowell, despite his initial confidence, was replaced. The Union needed a leader who could step up and unite the troops, someone who could transform their defeats into future victories. That man turned out to be Ulysses S. Grant. Initially seen as unimpressive and almost too quiet, Grant would soon rise through the ranks to prove himself as one of the greatest military leaders in American history. His determination, refusal to back down, and ability to outlast the enemy would be critical in the Union's ultimate success. Meanwhile, the South had its own military giants. General Robert E. Lee, already seen as a military prodigy, was commanding the Army of Northern Virginia, and his tactics were devastatingly effective. At battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee's ability to outmaneuver the Union forces gave the South crucial victories. Stonewall Jackson, Lee's most trusted general, became a legend in his own right, with his steadfast defense at Bull Run earning him his iconic nickname. The South's leadership was not just about military strategy, it was about morale. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Lee and Jackson gave the Confederacy hope. For the South, each victory was more than a military win, it was a reaffirmation of their cause. But even with their skilled leadership, the South's path was not secure. Every victory came at a heavy price, and with each passing battle, the Union was learning from its mistakes, adapting, and preparing for the next phase of the war. The first few years were a brutal test for both sides, but with new leadership on both fronts, it was clear that this war was far from over. The question was no longer if the South could win, it was whether the Union could stay unified long enough to stop them. And as the war raged on, both sides were about to realize just how high the cost of victory would be. By 1864, the Union was desperate for a victory, but they were lacking something crucial, leadership that could bring them across the finish line. Enter Ulysses S. Grant, who was appointed General-in-Chief of the Union Army. Grant wasn't a man of many words, but his strategy was clear and devastating: keep pressing, keep fighting, and wear down the Confederacy. His battles were not quick victories, they were bloody, grueling affairs. But that was exactly what the Union needed. He didn't shy away from heavy losses or the challenges ahead, he was relentless, and that relentlessness would begin to turn the tide. Grant knew that to defeat the Confederacy, the Union needed to take the fight directly to the South and never give them a chance to regroup. His overland campaign was a brutal march through Virginia, taking on Robert E. Lee's forces head-on. The battles at Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor were among the most horrific in American history, but each one took its toll on the Confederate Army. Grant kept pushing forward, with no intention of retreating. It was a war of attrition, and Grant had the stamina to outlast Lee and the South's dwindling resources. Meanwhile, William Tecumseh Sherman, another Union general, was wreaking havoc further south. Sherman was different. He wasn't just fighting armies, he was fighting the Confederacy's will to continue. In 1864, he launched his famous March to the Sea, cutting a swath of destruction through Georgia. Sherman's strategy was simple yet devastating: march, destroy, and break the South's morale. Atlanta fell in September, and by the time Sherman reached the coast, he had left nothing but burned cities, destroyed infrastructure, and broken spirits behind him. Sherman's march didn't just dismantle the Confederacy's military, it shattered the South's psychological resolve. It was a message they couldn't ignore: the Union was unstoppable. By 1865, the Confederate forces were nearing collapse. The Union was closing in on Richmond, the Confederate capital, and General Lee's army had been relentlessly pushed back. The Confederacy had no choice but to confront the truth: their hope for independence was fading fast. The Union was finally ready to finish what they had started. And by the spring of 1865, it was clear that the war was almost over. Robert E. Lee, the South's greatest general, had been outmaneuvered and outlasted. On April 9, 1865, Lee met with Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia. In a small, cramped room, the two generals faced each other, knowing this would be the end of the Confederacy. Lee, weary and defeated, surrendered his army to Grant, effectively marking the end of the Civil War. The Confederacy was no more. But the end of the war didn't come without its own tragic twist. Just days after the surrender at Appomattox, President Abraham Lincoln, the man who had held the Union together through years of bloodshed and division, was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln's death was a crushing blow to the nation that had just begun to heal. His leadership had preserved the Union, and in his death, the country lost its guiding light. The assassination of Lincoln was not just the loss of a president, it was the loss of the man who had fought tirelessly to keep the country intact. Just as the war ended, a new era of uncertainty began. But for now, the Union had been preserved, and the Confederacy was defeated. The Civil War had ended, but the nation's scars were deep and lasting. The Confederacy had been defeated, but the question remained: what now? The South was in ruins, its city shattered, its economy in collapse, and its people disillusioned. But the Union had won, and now, the difficult work of rebuilding the country began. The period known as Reconstruction was meant to heal the nation, particularly the South, and bring the formerly Confederate states back into the fold. It wasn't just about physical reconstruction, it was about rebuilding the very fabric of American society. This was a time when the country would try to integrate millions of formerly enslaved people into its political, social, and economic systems. But as much as Reconstruction was a time for renewal, it was also a period of intense struggle and bitter resistance. One of the most significant outcomes of this era were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which were passed in quick succession. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery, once and for all, ensuring that no person could be held in servitude in the United States. The 14th Amendment granted citizenship to anyone born in the U.S., ensuring that newly freed African Americans would have the same legal rights as any other citizen. And the 15th Amendment granted African American men the right to vote, a step forward in the battle for civil rights. These amendments were monumental, but their passage was not the end of the struggle. The South, devastated by war, was reluctant to accept the changes that had been imposed upon it. The wounds of war were still fresh, and the racial tensions that had fueled the conflict were far from healed. While African Americans had gained freedom, equality, and citizenship on paper, the reality of their lives, particularly in the South, remained a battle. Resistance to these changes was fierce, and even as the amendments were enacted, many Southern states found ways to undermine their impact through black codes and later Jim Crow laws. The American Civil War was not just a battle between North and South, it was a battle over the very soul of the nation. It was fought over the ideals of freedom, identity, and the future of a young republic. The sacrifices made on both sides were immense. Hundreds of thousands lost their lives, families were torn apart, and an entire way of life was upended. Yet, through this devastation, something new was forged, a new nation. The Civil War gave birth to the modern United States, one that was more united, but still divided in many ways. It forced the country to confront its deepest flaws, its moral failings, and its dreams for a better, more just future. But the echoes of the Civil War are still felt today. The fight for equality, justice, and a more perfect union continues, long after the final shots were fired and the last battle was fought. As we look back at this pivotal chapter in American history, we see the legacy of the Civil War in every struggle for civil rights, every step toward equality, and every moment when we as a nation are forced to confront our past. The Civil War shaped the course of American history, and its lessons continue to challenge and inspire us today. The war may have ended, but the fight for a better, more just America is far from over. If you found this story of the Civil War compelling, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. By subscribing, you'll stay updated on more gripping historical narratives and insightful analyses. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What part of the Civil War history fascinates you the most? Let's keep the conversation going, and thank you for watching.